I consider ES6 modules as one of the greatest additions to the JavaScript language because it helps make JavaScript a very modular language with native support from the language. If you had to use other tools like CommonJS in the past to make your code modular, you know the pain that came with. My name is Kelvin, and I am a software developer based in Nairobi, Kenya. And my goal is to help you go through technical documentations so that you may have an understanding of the tools that you're working with. In case you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. In case we mention any link in this video, you can find it in the description section of this video. Let us jump right in. In case you are using VS Code as your code editor of choice, I will recommend that you install the Quokka.js extension. And what this enables me to do is to console log my code directly in my editor during runtime. But for these specific examples that we shall look at, that is ES6 modules, you will notice that you might not have some of the functionality available because this functionality is only available in the pro version of Quokka.js. But in case you want to still follow along using Quokka.js, you can get a temporary trial license, I think for 7 days, and you can still follow along this way. But in case you don't want to go down this road, you can still follow along using the browser console. But you need to make one change on your index.html file to make the examples work in the browser. One change that you will make on your script, you will have to include the type module. You can still follow along using the browser console. So without out of the way, let us dive into ES6 module. I have a file called app.js, and in the file I have defined two functions. The first function is setName, which basically is a setter method to the name variable. Then the second function is greet, which takes the value in the name variable and returns a greeting. So in case I want this functionality to be available in other parts of my application, or I want to make it modular, ES6 introduced what we call an export keyword. So I'm able to export the functionality of this file to be reused in other parts of the application. And in order for us to do this, we have two main methods. We can export the variable or the function or the class directly in the same line by including the keyword export, or another way, at the end of the file, we can also have export keyword, open curly braces, then export the functions, variables, or classes the same way. So we can export the set name that way. Then for greet, we can still just do it inline. And in order for us to reuse this functionality in another class, we can simply use the import keyword, because these are what we refer to as named exports. We need to open the curly brace and then point to the file that includes those imports. So app.js. And then in the curly braces, we can reference the files or the functionality that has been exported from app.js using their specific names. So in this case, name, set name, and greet are the names that we will include in the curly braces. Let's say name, set name, and greet. Let us console log the results. You can see that we're getting the name of Kelvin, and when we do greet, we are getting hi Kelvin. And finally, we can change the name, so set name of codes. So we can see that it is changing as expected. You can also see that in the browser, it is also console logging those results. Let us close the browser so that we can have more space to work with. One important thing to note is when it comes to exporting variables and functions, they are treated as constants. The way you treat a constant in JavaScript If you haven't watched my video on the const keyword, I will be linking it on the card above. One thing about the const keyword is once it has been declared or we have declared a constant, we are not able to override the value that is stored in that const. A good example would be name. So we cannot override name directly. So in case I want to do name is equal to codes, you can see that assignment to a constant variable. So basically, as much as we do have the name constant declared as a let, and we do know that we have the ability to override the value that has been initialized in the let variable, we are not allowed to override it once it has been exported. So all the imports are treated as constant. And in order for us to override the values, we have to use a setter method. If we use the set name, we are able to override the value in the name variable and get it logged. So apart from the named exports, we also have what we call a default export. Let's say I want the greet function to be a default export. And what I will need to do is just declare the export as default. So let us convert the set name to be a named export inline, and then convert the greet function to be a default export. One of the major change between the default export and the named export is for the default export, we can only have one default export per file. But the beauty is we can name it anything that we want in the import. Let us see how to do that. So when we are importing the files, the default export will be outside the parentheses. And we can see that we are getting the same results. Let me just remove the name. We can see that we are getting the same results. And the beauty is instead of having greet, we can basically name it anything that we want. Let me say salute. And you can see that we are getting the same result, which is really awesome. But when it also comes to named export, we are not limited to only using the names. We can also change them to whatever we like, and that is by using the as keyword. So we can say name as maybe any name. We can basically name it anything that we want. And when we console those results, we can see that we are getting the same result as expected. So function set name as, let's just call it setter. And you can see that we are getting the same result as expected. When it comes to default exports, it is the first item in the export, and we can basically choose any name that we please other than the name that was used to export it as a default export. But when it comes to named export, we have to explicitly specify using the as keyword in case we want to rename it. There might be a scenario where you want to export the entire module. And in that case, we can use the asterisk. Then we can follow it up with the as keyword. Let's just say util for lack of a better name. And basically by using util, you have access to all the methods, all the variables, all the classes that have been exported from that module. So you can just use the util.name. You can see I'm getting Kelvin. Util.setName. You have that functionality. But one interesting thing is, in order for us to access the default function, variable, or class that has been exported, we have to use the default. So in this case, util.default. And you can see that we are getting high Kelvin. So this might be important when you want to namespace your exports. You might consider using the asterisk to export the entire module. Let us look at some of the limitations of import and export statement. The most obvious is we cannot export in a condition. So in case we want to export maybe set name conditionally, let's say if true, then export, you can see that it fails. We cannot do an export in a condition. Vice versa, we can also not do an import in a condition. So in index.js, let's say we have greet. So basically, we cannot do an import in a condition if true, import. This is not possible. But I'm saying this with a caveat. We do know that in ES 2020, there was an introduction of dynamic imports. So instead of just using the import keyword, we can take advantage of an import function, which is a global function, which can work dynamically in a condition. Just to show you maybe how we handle that in ES20, we can use import. Then we can call in the file or the module that we want to import dynamically. And this basically gives us a promise. We shall also go over a promise in a future video. Then we can have a function and we can catch any error in case they are there. We can just have the module and we can console log to see what the module contains. And you can see that we are getting the same functions and variables that are defined in that module. In case we want to access the name, we can do module.name and we have access to the name. We can also choose to destructure this. If you haven't watched my video about object destructuring, I will be linking it up in the card above. So you can destructure and just get the name directly from the module. And that works as expected. One final thing that we can take a look at is re-exporting a binding. Let's say we have an import of greet and other named exports, that is name and set name. In case we want to export this out of this file, we have the ability to do that just by specifying the export keyword, then passing the export out. So we can say name and set name. We are able to do that. We can even export the greet function out of this file as a named export. We can also do a default export. So export default and just pass a single function or variable. We can choose to set name as the default export. So we have the ability to also do that. In case you have found value in this video, you can subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. You can also leave a comment on what you would want to be improved in this channel. Thank you and see you soon.